Right, that ends questions. We now come to the Prime Minister, who's going to make a statement on CHOGM, G7 and the NATO summit. Prime Minister Boris Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I'll make a statement about the NATO, G7 and Commonwealth summits held in Madrid, Schloss Elmau and Kigali, respectively. In the space of 7 days, I had the opportunity to work alongside more than 80 governments, nearly half the entire membership of the United Nations, and hold bilateral talks with over 25 leaders, ranging from the new presidents of South Korea and Zambia to the prime ministers of Japan and Jamaica, demonstrating the global reach of Britain's diplomacy and the value of our presence at the world's top tables. Our immediate priority is to join with our allies to ensure that Ukraine prevails in her brave struggle against Putin's aggression. At the Madrid summit, NATO exceeded all expectations in the unity and single-minded resolve of the alliance to support Ukraine for as long as it takes and to explode the myth that Western democracies lack the staying power for a prolonged crisis. All of us understand that if Putin is not stopped in Ukraine, he will find new targets for his revanchist attacks, and we are not defending some abstract ideal, but the first principle of a peaceful world, which is that large and powerful countries cannot be allowed to dismember their neighbours. And if this was ever permitted, then no nation anywhere would be safe. Therefore, our goal must be for our Ukrainian friends to win, by which I mean that Ukraine must have the strength to finish this war on the terms that President Zelensky has described. And when Putin claimed that by invading his neighbour he would force NATO away from Russia, he could not have been proved more spectacularly wrong, because the single most welcome outcome of the Madrid summit was the alliance's agreement to admit Finland and Sweden. And I hope I speak for the whole House when I say that Britain will be proud to stand alongside these fellow democracies and reaffirm our unshakable pledge to come to their aid and defend them if ever necessary, just as they would for us. We were glad to smooth their path into NATO by giving both nations the security assurances they needed to apply for membership. And when I met Prime Minister Andersson of Sweden and President Niinistö of Finland last Wednesday, I told them I was certain that NATO would be stronger and safer for their accession. Before Putin's onslaught, both countries had prized their neutrality even through all the crises of the Cold War. And it's a measure of how seriously they take today's threat that opinion in Sweden and Finland has been transformed. And it speaks volumes about Putin's folly that one permanent consequence of his attack on Ukraine will be a doubling of the length of NATO's border with Russia. If anyone needed proof that NATO is purely defensive, the fact that two quintessentially peaceable countries should have chosen to join demonstrates the true nature of our alliance. Yeah. And now is the time to intensify our help for Ukraine, because Putin's Donbass offensive is slowing down and his overstretched army is suffering heavy casualties. And Ukraine's success in forcing the Russians off Snake Island by sheer weight of firepower shows how difficult the invader will find it to hold the territory he has overrun. We need to equip our friends now to take advantage of the moment when Putin will have to pause and regroup. So NATO will supply Ukraine with another £1 billion of military aid, including air defences, drones and electronic warfare equipment, bringing our total military, humanitarian and economic support since the 24th of February to nearly £4 billion. And to guarantee the security of our allies on the eastern flank, NATO agreed in Madrid to bolster its high readiness forces, and we in the UK will offer even more British forces to the alliance, including almost all of our surface fleet. We have already doubled our deployment in Estonia, and we will upgrade our national headquarters to be led by a brigadier, and help our Estonian friends to establish their own divisional headquarters. If you follow the trajectory of our programmes to modernise our armed forces, Mr. Speaker, you will draw the logical conclusion that the UK will likely be spending 2.5% of GDP on defence by the end of this decade. Earlier, at the G7 summit, the first full day of talks coincided with a Russian missile destroying a Ukrainian shopping centre, killing at least 18 people. This barbaric attack on an obviously civilian target strengthened the resolve of my fellow leaders to provide Ukraine with more financial, humanitarian, military and diplomatic backing for, and I quote the communiqué again, as long as it takes. Exactly the terms later echoed by NATO. The G7 has pledged nearly $30 billion of financial support for Ukraine this year, and we will tighten our sanctions on Russia, and the UK will join America, Japan and Canada to ban the import of Russian gold, which previously raised more export revenues than anything else except hydrocarbons. The G7 will devise more options for ensuring that nearly 25 million tonnes of grain trapped inside Ukraine by Putin's blockade reaches the countries that rely on these supplies. Just as the world economy was recovering from the pandemic, Putin's war has caused a surge in global food and energy prices, raising the cost of living everywhere, including here at home. The G7 agreed, and I quote, to take immediate action to secure energy supply and reduce price surges, including by exploring additional measures such as price caps. And we will help our partners in the developing world to meet their climate targets and transform millions of lives by constructing new infrastructure according to the highest standards of transparency and environmental protection. Through our Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, an idea launched by the UK at the Cardiff Bay Summit last year, we will mobilise up to $600 billion of public and private investment over the next 5 years. Many beneficiary nations will be members of the Commonwealth, and I was very pleased to attend the summit in Kigali of this unique association of 56 states encompassing a third of humanity. More countries are eager to join, and we were pleased to welcome 2 new members in Gabon and Togo. It's an amazing fact that our familiar legal and administrative systems, combined with the English language, knock 21% off the cost of trade between Commonwealth members. And it's because the Commonwealth unites that advantage with some of the fastest growing markets in the world that we're using the sovereignty that the UK has regained to sign free trade or economic partnership agreements with as many Commonwealth countries as possible. So far, we've done 33, including Australia and New Zealand, and we're aiming for India by Diwali in October. But it's true, Mr. Speaker, that not every member of the Commonwealth sees Putin's aggression as we do, or exactly as we do. And it was vital to have the opportunity to counter the myths and to point out that food prices are rising because Putin has blockaded one of the world's biggest food producers. And if large countries are free to destroy their neighbours, then no Commonwealth member, however distant from Ukraine, would be genuinely secure. The fact that in a week the UK was able to deal on friendly terms with scores of countries in 3 organisations shows the extraordinary diplomatic assets our country possesses. And as we stand up for what is right in Ukraine and advance the values and interests of the British people, I commend this statement to the House.
I now call Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of his statement and to welcome him back to these shores. They say that absence makes the heart grow fonder. So I wish him the best of luck in seeing if that works as a party management strategy. Mr. Speaker, it's been 131 days since Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. 131 days of war at the heart of our continent. 131 days of Putin trying to cower his neighbours. 131 days of brave Ukrainian resistance. I've always said that this House and Britain's allies must put aside our differences in other areas and show unity in our opposition to Putin's aggression. And we have, driven by the inspiration provided by the people of Ukraine and the leadership and courage of President Zelensky. As this conflict reaches its 6th month and drags on in eastern Ukraine, it's important that we don't think our job is done. Putin would like nothing better than for us to lose our focus, for the grip of sanctions to weaken, for military aid to Ukraine to dry up, or for cracks to appear in the unity of Putin's opponents. So I welcome the progress made at the NATO summit last week and congratulate our good friends in Finland and Sweden for their formal invitation to join the NATO alliance. And, of course, Ukraine on securing their candidate status to join the European Union. I hope these processes can be concluded as quickly as possible to send a clear message to Putin that his war has permanently changed the European landscape, but not in the way that he planned. I also welcome the commitment to strengthen our collective deterrent capabilities. I've seen firsthand how British personnel are working with other NATO forces to ensure the collective shield that's protected us for 3/4 of a century remains as strong as ever. So I welcome the agreement on the new NATO force model, ensuring over 300,000 conventional troops will be at high readiness across Europe. Can I ask the Prime Minister how this agreement will affect British military planning and if he believes our extra commitments can be met given his cuts to UK troop numbers? The commitment made at the G7 of further financial support for Ukraine is also welcome, as are plans to help Ukraine with post-war reconstruction through an international conference. Mr. Speaker, there can be no clearer case that aid spending makes Britain more secure and prevents the need for military spending in the future, which demonstrates the folly in reducing our aid commitments at a time of global instability. I'm pleased that unity was on display at both the NATO summit and the G7 summit, but I am concerned about current unity within the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is a valuable and important institution for this country. It isn't just a symbol of our past, it's important for our future, providing us with influence in all parts of the world. But in recent years, there have been serious signs of strain. When many major Commonwealth countries abstained at the UN over Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the summit should have been an opportunity to widen diplomatic coalition against Putin. Instead, the Prime Minister waged a divisive campaign against the Commonwealth leadership that ended up in a humiliating diplomatic failure, only illustrating his embarrassing lack of influence. Instead of investing in aid that strengthens the alliance, he's cut it. Instead of upholding the rule of law that should define the Commonwealth, he reneges on treaties that he's signed, undermining Britain's moral and political credibility when we need our word to carry trust. My fear is simple. The vacuum we leave behind will be quickly filled, not by those who share our values, but by those who seek to destroy them. We cannot let that happen in Ukraine. We cannot let that happen anywhere. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the right honourable gentleman for the terms in which, broadly speaking, he has addressed the the UK's recent diplomatic activity. Just a couple of points to come back on. He talks about the UK breaking international treaties, Mr. Speaker. Actually, that is, I don't know what he's talking about there, but he's talking about what we're doing in respect to the Northern Ireland Protocol. Then that is not what is happening, Mr. Speaker. We believe that our obligation, our prior obligation, which I would have thought he supported, is to the balance of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. That's what we're supporting. And actually, he talks about the UK's ability to win people over. It was very striking, Mr. Speaker, in the conversations I had with leaders from around the world, how few of them, if any, raised the issue, Mr. Speaker, of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and how much, Mr. Speaker, people want to see common sense and no new barriers to trade. What the UK is doing is trying to reduce pointless barriers to trade, and you would have thought, Mr. Speaker, that he would support that. And on his points about the UK's contribution to NATO and to the new force model, and whether that is sustainable, I really suggest, Mr. Speaker, that members opposite should talk to the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg about what the UK is producing and what the UK is committing. It is colossal. We are the second biggest contributor to NATO. We're the second biggest contributor overall to support for the Ukrainians, Mr. Speaker, of 2.3 billion in military assistance alone. And what we're also doing, Mr. Speaker, is making sure that our armed forces are provided for the future with £24 billion in this spending review, the biggest uplift in defence spending since the Cold War. Defence spending now running at 2.3% of our national GDP, above the 2% target, Mr. Speaker. That is felt around the room in NATO. People know what the UK is contributing, and they are extremely grateful. What the UK also contributes to NATO, under the new force model, we will contribute virtually all our naval forces, Mr. Speaker. But we also, as he knows, we are the only country to contribute our strategic independent nuclear deterrent to NATO. And I still find it a sad reflection on the party opposite that at this critical time, when Vladimir Putin is very sadly using the language of nuclear blackmail, we are in a situation in which the principal party of opposition in this country still has 8 members on its front bench who voted to discard our independent nuclear deterrent, Mr. Speaker, including the shadow Foreign Secretary. So apart from that, Mr. Speaker, I welcome the terms in which the right honourable gentleman has responded.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Could I very much welcome the Prime Minister's statement? Could I ask the Prime Minister, was there general agreement at all 3 summits that our fragile rules-based order is under threat, and strategically we've entered a profound era of geopolitical change? Could I commend the Prime Minister's efforts in Ukraine? It's a shame other NATO countries haven't lent as much as we've done. But could I commend or encourage the Prime Minister to go further and to secure a UN General Assembly resolution to create a humanitarian safe haven around that critical port of Odessa, so those vital grain exports can not only reach Europe but also Africa and prevent famine there?
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend for his point, particularly about grain exports, and as he knows, the work is being led by the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres. The UK is doing a huge amount to support Mr. Speaker, but as I've told the House before, we may have to prepare for a solution that does not depend upon Russian consent, because that may not be forthcoming.
SNP Leader Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of his statement and welcome him back from his travels around Africa and Europe. And it's perhaps worth reiterating, Mr. Speaker, that all of us in this House reiterate our support for President Zelensky, for Ukraine, in their struggle against the war criminal Putin. Mr. Speaker, the scale and the depth of the challenge facing our global community is self-evident. War in Europe, the return of soaring inflation, rising interest rates, and a cost of living crisis that is punishing people in the pocket. We're not just faced with one crisis. This is an accumulation of crisis that needs, deserves and demands a collective response. We know that at moments like this, solutions can only come from a coordinated effort. Previous efforts during the 2007 financial crisis, and the coordination during COVID demonstrate just that right across the world. And none of us should be in any doubt. The crisis we are now in is as very bit as severe and steep and deep as anything that we faced in the time of the financial crisis. But, Mr Speaker, so far, and I regret to say this, that the collective effort, that sense of urgency, has been badly lacking, particularly from organisations like the G7. The response has been far too slow and far too small. Prime Minister, it is obvious that the G7 outcomes are nowhere near enough to combat the cost of living crisis that we now face. So, when can the public expect some leadership and some action? When will we see a coherent, coordinated and credible plan to increase energy supply, cap prices and drive investment to the global economy before recession becomes inevitable? Or is the plan really to delay until the winter, when things will only get worse? Leadership now, in responding to supply shocks, will allow us to fight inflation, or a failure to take appropriate action exposes all of us to longer-lasting inflationary risks. On Ukraine, can the Prime Minister perhaps go a little bit further and give us an outlook as to what we will do to make sure that we can get grain out of Ukrainian ports? 400 million people worldwide rely on Ukrainian food supplies. This is now not just about stopping war, it's about stopping famine too. And finally, I'm sure the Prime Minister will agree that of all these global efforts will only begin and will only work if there is trust between global leaders. Can the Prime Minister therefore explain that in this moment of many crises, how exactly breaking international law and threatening to start a trade war with our neighbours helps anyone?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Actually, I think that he should look more carefully at what the G7 produced in terms of the plan to cap prices for oil and gas, and particularly to try to stop Putin profiteering as he currently is from his illegal war. And there is a plan. It's not. I won't pretend it's going to be easy, but we're doing as much as we can, and we're certainly taking a lot of other action, for instance, to help countries around the world with access to fertiliser that they need. And he's right to raise the issue, Mr. Speaker, of the 25 million tonnes of grain currently held hostage in Odessa. There is a plan to get that out. It's not easy, but if you look at the numbers, we are gradually getting more grain out of those Ukrainian silos back into Europe, back into Africa, and we will continue to do that. As for his final point, Mr. Speaker, about the UK and a so-called breach of international law, I really repeat what I said to the right honourable gentleman opposite. What the countries around the world see is the UK offering consistent leadership in the matter of standing up for the rule of law and standing up against Putin's aggression. And that is, I promise you, that is what has been raised with me in the last 10 days.
Shelbrooke.
Mr. Speaker, may I congratulate my right honourable friend for the leadership he's shown in this previous week, and welcome his commitment to our Royal Navy forces being part of NATO. As my Defence Security Committee on the NATO Parliamentary Assembly starts its investigation for the next 2 years into the Russian maritime threat, can I ask my honourable friend, does he see the ongoing support of the Royal Navy in the long term, and what conversation can he have with other NATO allies to increase their maritime support to this vital mission?
I thank my honourable friend, and I want to congratulate him, by the way, on his work for the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, which was mentioned to me at the summit. And I can tell him that the UK is leading the NATO alliance in providing for the new force model in our naval commitment, and we're trying to encourage others to do the same.
Hilary Van.
Thank you very much. Indeed, Mr. Speaker. Further to the question from the right honourable member for Paul Feast, the Prime Minister will know that time is running out to get grain to the hundreds of millions of people who will be facing destitution and hunger, as the Secretary-General has warned. Could he tell us who is going to provide the security guarantees to Ukraine? Because the fear is, if you open a sea corridor, that the Russians will seek to use it to attack Odessa. And can he confirm that it is to Turkey that the world is looking to provide those guarantees so the grain can get out, before the moment is lost.
Prime Minister.
Right, honourable gentleman is completely right. The Turks are absolutely indispensable to solving this, and they are doing their very best. I thank President Erdogan for the efforts that he is making. It does depend on the Russians agreeing to allow that grain to get out. The UK is offering demining facilities. We're offering insurance facilities for the vessels that will be needed to get the grain out, Mr. Speaker. But we will, if he's right about the urgency, we will increasingly have to look at alternative means of moving that grain from Ukraine if we cannot use the sea route, if we can't use the Bosphorus.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Before there was a shooting war in Europe, in the 1980s, does the Prime Minister accept that it was right for this country to spend 5% of GDP on defence? And if he does, why does he think it's adequate for us to spend only half that percentage by the end of this decade?
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend very much, and he has campaigned on this issue for years. And I have to say that I think that we will have to spend more, and logically, Mr. Speaker, if you protract the commitments that we are making under AUKUS and under the Future Combat Aircraft System, we will be increasing our spending very considerably. What we want to do is to make sure that other allies are doing the same. And that is the most important. We want to see, that's why Jens Stoltenberg is we hope, going to be setting a new target and allowing the whole of the alliance to increase their funding.
David.
Speaker, while the Prime Minister was talking about British values at 3 international summits, he was whipping Conservative MPs to vote to trash one of our greatest British values, the rule of law. And while the Prime Minister was talking about increasing defence spending, he is ploughing ahead with plans to cut the British Armed Forces by 10,000 troops. And while the Prime Minister was talking about the problem of global price rises, he is raising unfair taxes on millions of pensioners and families across our country. So, Mr. Speaker, we are facing a domestic economic crisis, a global security crisis, and the Prime Minister is facing his own political crisis. So can he tell the House what precisely is his plan to take our country forward?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy to tell the right honourable gentleman that our plan is to help the people of this country as we are with the cost of living, with £1,200 coming into people's bank accounts since he's asked, Mr. Speaker, this month. Which we can do because of the sensible economic steps that we have taken in coming out of the pandemic, but then to build on a stronger economy, Mr. Speaker, with reforms to our planning, to our housing, to our transport, to our energy networks, we will take down costs for people up and down the country, Mr. Speaker, and continue to make this place the best place to live in and invest in the whole of our hemisphere. That's our plan for the country, and I commend it to it.
Read it.
Western purchasers of Russian energy are paying for Putin's war. So will he redouble his efforts to make sure we invest in more production and output of oil, gas and electricity here to make our contribution to reducing Western dependence?
Mr. Speaker, yes, I think the UK can be very proud of the way that we have moved beyond hydrocarbons in so many areas, but we have to recognise the limits and the pace of what we've achieved, and we have to be less neuralgic about using our domestic hydrocarbons, particularly when the alternative is just to import them from abroad.
Chris Brown.
Mr. Speaker, it's 3,056 days since Putin started his illegal invasion of Ukraine, and we spent far too long turning a blind eye to what was going on there. So forgive me if I'm just a little bit impatient, even about what we have already achieved. I want to see a British industrial strategy to make sure we're making enough lethal weaponry to give to the Ukrainians so that they can win. I want to see a major diplomatic effort to make sure that Putin isn't going to make further inroads in Republika Srpska and Bosnia. I also want to make sure that we as a country are still as focused on the laundering of dirty Russian money through the City of London as we should have been 10 years ago.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as he knows, the UK led the way in Europe in supplying weaponry to Ukraine. The end laws were of great importance, Mr. Speaker, and when it comes to sanctions, I think the UK has, we have a new economic crime bill coming in that will help us to clamp down further, but what we have done already is very, very considerable, and the squeeze is being felt by Putin and his economy, and we will continue to apply it. And I think he asked for a long-term strategy. What he got from the G7 and from NATO was a commitment to stick the course for as long as it takes, and that's what we're going to do.
Mark Harper.
Mr. Speaker. When the Prime Minister's remarks at the NATO summit were reported last week, the 2.5% commitment to spend on defence appeared to be really quite solid. His remarks today are less so. So assuming it is a commitment, can I just ask him, is it a commitment? And secondly, how are we going to pay for it? Because you have to have a credible plan to pay for it. Are we going to put up taxes? Or are we going to reduce expenditure in other areas to deliver what is a welcome and important commitment to the defence of the United Kingdom?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this is a straightforward protraction of a prediction based on what we are currently committed to spending under the AUKUS programme and under the FCAS programme as well. These are gigantic commitments. I think they're the right thing for the UK. They will take us up to that threshold. Of course, it much depends on the size of our GDP at the time, Mr. Speaker. Much depends on the growth in the economy. And he asked how we're going to pay for it. I think we're going to pay for it out of steady and sustained economic growth, as I said to the gentleman opposite.
Joanna Chorley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Northern Irish Protocol Bill, the Legacy and Reconciliation Bill and the Bill of Rights are all bills which numerous informed commentators and cross-party committees of this House have said threaten to breach our international treaty obligations. And I note he indicated to the Leader of the Opposition that some of his interlocutors last week at least had raised these issues with him. And all of us who've travelled abroad in parliamentary business recently will have had these issues raised with us. So can he tell us exactly what concerns were raised with him over the last week about his government's disrespect for the international rule of law and human rights, and what he's going to do about it?
Prime Minister.
I can tell that the Honourable Lady absolutely categorically, not a single person said that the UK was in breach of international law. On the contrary, what they did say was that we were helping the world to stand up against breaches of international law.
Mercer.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister should absolutely be congratulated on defence spending and what he's done on it. Whilst many in his position previously have talked about it, actually this is the biggest increase since the end of the Cold War. But would he confirm to me that no directive has been issued from Number 10 or the Treasury on defence numbers, on numbers of personnel, and that will continue to be the case going forward should the situation continue to change?
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much, and I think he speaks wisely on this matter, which he knows very, very well, and we keep the actual numbers under constant review. The most important thing, Mr. Speaker, is to have our troops are the best in the world, but they've also got to have the best equipment in the world, and that's what we're paying for.
Liam Byrne.
Thank you, sir. I was relieved to see the G7 recognise that 200 million people now face starvation around the world, along with the pledge to mobilise $100 billion in IMF special drawing rights to help alleviate the crisis. Last week, however, the Foreign Secretary couldn't tell us how much the UK has been given in special drawing rights, nor what her target was for sharing them back, presumably because it wasn't on Instagram. So can the Prime Minister help us? Can he reassure us that all 19 billion of the UK's new special drawing rights will be shared to help with this crisis in order to set a good example to the rest of the world?
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much, and he's absolutely right to draw attention to the use of special drawing rights, and we are supportive of using those for the benefit of people who are currently finding things very, very tough around the world.
I strongly support the government commitment to 2.5% and the Prime Minister's hint at this question time that we may go further than that in the years to come. But would he not agree with me, nonetheless, that the last year's integrated review talked about cutting conventional forces, tanks, aircraft, and people put boots on the ground, and that one of the lessons of Ukraine is we must not do that? Will he once again look at the commitments we have made to cutting, particularly our infantry, and think again about it?
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much, and I know that my honourable friend has military experience himself, but what we're learning from Ukraine, Mr. Speaker, is that the vital importance of having troops, having a military operation that has a 360-degree protection and has the best possible equipment. And that is a lesson that I think the Russians are learning to their cost themselves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will have heard the deep concern across both sections of this House, particularly in response to his answers to the member from Bournemouth and the member from Leeds about the grain in Ukraine and the issue of world hunger and poverty. And he said there in his response that he was talking about the possibility of seeking a solution that may not have the consent of the Russians. So for avoidance of doubt, can he confirm to this House if he is looking at breaching the Montreux Agreement about larger forces in the Black Sea, please?
I thank her very much, and she's right to raise that. No, we're not looking at that. There are alternative solutions that don't involve the presence of UK or other warships in the Black Sea, though they might involve a tougher approach. But I think what we're also looking at is the possibility of using the rivers, using the Danube in particular, to try to get using the railways to try to get the grain out in smaller quantities than we would be able to do with a giant convoy through giant maritime convoy through the Black Sea. So we're looking at all the possible options, including smaller packets of grain coming out that way.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend stated Ukraine must have the strength to finish this war in the way President Zelensky described. Are we confident that all our allies are being as involved and supportive as the UK has been and continues to be for as long as it takes?
Prime Minister.
I think the answer to that is yes, Mr. Speaker, because every time we go to one of these summits and we think that the alliance is friable and that the strength of the pro-Ukrainian coalition is weak, actually people gravitate towards the centre and towards what the UK is saying, basically because there's no alternative. Putin isn't offering any kind of deal. President Zelensky can't do any kind of land for peace deal. There's no other option for us but to continue to support the Ukrainians in the way that we are. And that's why the unity remains so compelling.
Christian Batters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I absolutely understand that the sanctions regime so far has focused on the Russian elite, travel bans, for example, bans on export of luxury goods, as well as Russian hydrocarbons that earn them so much foreign exchange money. But as my honourable friend from Rhondda said, is it not now the time, as this war continues into the longer term, that we look at the Russian money that is still sloshing around in the UK and assume that if somebody has made a large amount of money in Putin's Russia, the chances are it's dodgy, and start to tighten that domestic sanctions regime?
Prime Minister.
He's of course right that we've got to keep tightening the noose the whole time. The Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Bill will help give us new powers to seize crypto assets, new powers over money laundering. But one thing I think that he would have spotted at the G7, I think was very important, was the new sanctions on Russian gold, which I mentioned in my statement. 13.5 billion pounds worth of sanctions on Russian gold. That will hit them.
Build up, Bim Afaloma.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome what the Prime Minister said about working with other countries to reduce the price of oil and gas. That's critical in this country, indeed across the world. Could he give the House a bit more detail on how we've been working with other countries, particularly in the Commonwealth, on investing in renewable energy, which is clean, safe and secure and reduces our dependence on hydrocarbons over the medium term?
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much. And the answer is that we're making massive investments as UK in Commonwealth countries, but as the G7, as I said, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment is there specifically to help developing countries around the world to move forwards, to make the leap ahead to green technology and take investment from the UK and not perhaps from others who are busier in getting them to pay their debts.
Neil Hanby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened carefully to the Prime Minister's warm words about the Commonwealth and the relationship between independent countries. And of course, in 1941, it was then Prime Minister Churchill that signed the Atlantic Charter with the United States, committing both Britain and the United States to delivering people's right to choose their own form of government and self-government. This respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples was incorporated into the United Nations Charter in paragraph 2 of Articles 1, 73 and 76. In light of this, can the Prime Minister set out what mandate he has won which allows him to breach this UN principle, deny Scotland's claim of right and hold Scotland's democracy hostage?
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much, and I know that the First Minister has asked for another referendum. I just point out that we had one in 2014. I think right now the priorities of the country should be rebuilding after COVID. They should be taking us forward together as a united country, and that's what we want to do.
Sir Edward Lee.
Ukraine is by far the most important issue facing us, not least in terms of preventing mass starvation in Africa. One can't help noticing that, unlike all the other fluff in the newspapers every day, nobody dares criticise the Prime Minister's resolute leadership on Ukraine. But what concerns many of us is that some of our allies don't seem to be as resolute as he, that whilst they will give full support to Ukraine not to lose this war, they're not that keen on Ukraine winning this war because they don't want to humiliate Putin. So can the Prime Minister make clear that it is the absolute commitment of NATO to defeat Putin once and for all?
Minister.
I agree 100% with what my right honourable friend has said, with one clarification, which is it is 100% the objective of NATO and all our friends and allies to make sure that Putin fails in Ukraine. And I think it's very, very important that we frame it in that way, Mr. Speaker. And he can and he will, Mr. Speaker, because the Ukrainians won't have it any other way.
Very good.
Rwanda and the UK hosted the Keeping 1.5 Alive event in Kigali. But at the same time, the latest IPCC report said that the requirement, the opportunity to keep within 1.5 had now shifted forward from 2032 to 2025. Given that most major emitters in the G7 are not actually even meeting their Paris commitments made 7 years ago, what realistic chance does the Prime Minister believe there is that the G7 will step up to the plate in the next 3 years and achieve that turning down of emissions?
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much, and if he looked at the G7 communique, he will have seen there was an explicit reference to making sure that anything we did was within our COP26 commitments to keeping 1.5 alive and to the commitments made under Paris.
Crispin Blood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I strongly welcome this statement from the Prime Minister and say that in my time in the House, I can't recall a foreign affairs statement in which the serving Prime Minister could take more personal satisfaction than the one he has just delivered to the House. That his leadership of NATO and getting the very welcome conclusions of the NATO summit then only reinforce what the Leader of the Opposition said, that what Mr. Putin wants is for us to lose focus. Will he sustain his focus, get the grain out of Ukraine for the desperate need of the rest of the world, and ensure Ukraine's survival as a sovereign state?
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend very much, and that certainly remains the objective of the government. But I stress that this is what we're doing to support the Ukrainians. It's not just a right in itself, Mr. Speaker, which everybody accepts. It's also right for the world, and that's why it continues to be supported around the world.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The NATO summit rightly identified that Russia and China challenge our security. China continues to make it clear the territories that they dispute in the Indo-Pacific. As war rages in Ukraine, concerns for the West's ammunition stockpiles are growing, and the Prime Minister is continuing with plans that will see capability gaps in our Navy, less planes, less tanks and less troops. Without a drastic rethink of these cuts, how realistic is the UK's desire in the integrated review to have a presence in both the North Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific?
Prime Minister.
Well, actually, Mr. Speaker, what our friend, at the Commonwealth Summit, the most interesting thing was the widespread understanding of what the UK is doing in the Indo-Pacific tilt, and the moves we're making to engage with that part of the world to strengthen our friends and allies in that region. You saw what, Mr. Speaker, what we did with the Carrier Strike Group. Absolutely astonishing exercise, and there are, you know about the AUKUS commitment that we've made, Mr. Speaker, and we're opening embassies in that part of the world and increasing our deployments there as well.
Robert General.
Mr. Speaker, the single most impactful thing that we could do now to bear down on the cost of living would be to encourage OPEC, and in particular Saudi Arabia, to pump more oil. What is